Good morning. Uh, I would like to talk about the nephron unit today, and we're going to start at the glomerulus in the Bowman's capsule. Now, the Bowman's capsule is the surrounding container for what is a fairly high pressure sieve. You have specialized cells here, podocytes, that keep these loose collections of cells together. It isn't even really capillary vessels at that point because there's gaps, clear gaps in between these endothelial cells instead of what we have in the capillary bed. But there's this really thick um, and tight extracellular matrix called a basement membrane in between, and that is works somewhat like a colander or a sieve to keep all the red blood cells and white blood cells and platelets and large proteins in, but it'll allow amino acids, glucose, urea, water, salt, all the liquid parts, the plasma, to go out and is pushed out at high pressure. And it goes in between these cells. But remember, if these cells are damaged so that this area doesn't have that sieve property to keep the red blood cells in anymore, it will go into the urine. But basically, all that blood comes in from the arteriole, and therefore it's uh, oxygen rich blood. All the plasma and water is squeezed out into the Bowman's capsule, and then the blood goes back out. But remember, this blood is very dry and low in basically everything except cells, and that will flow around and past the proximal convoluted tubes and others later on. So what is coming out of here is needs to be reconstituted as blood because it is very thick and dry, relatively. So once we get into the Bowman's capsule, all that liquid has only one way to go because this capsule goes all the way around and has a seal here. So it goes down the proximal convoluted tubule. I like showing the pictures of these just so that everybody has an idea of what things look like here. In this one, it's a little bit reversed. The glomerulus is here and the Bowman's capsule is here. And here's the proximal convoluted tubule. Here's the descending loop of Henle and ascending loop of Henle, and then the distal convoluted tubule going to the collecting duct. So basically, in this glomerulus, in the Bowman's capsule, we have all that plasma, amino acids, various nutrients, glucose, urea, salts, all that stuff that is pushed through to the proximal convoluted tubule. And then we have to start putting the nutrients back in. So we have these cells that have a lot of surface area into the tube. So it will interact with a lot of nutrients. In this case, it'll have salt, and with the salt, the sodium of the salt, it'll bring glucose into the cell. Now, the cell probably uses some of this, but most of it is transported out into this space right outside the uh, that blood that just released most of its nutrients, which is the um, afferent um, capillary bed. Let me get, there we go. Okay. So we have sodium also going in, ions going back out. So we make this interior fluid more acidic, but we have to do that. Otherwise, we would have an electrical charge difference. All the sodium goes in, and there's no positive charge in there. We can have a charge imbalance. Now, potassium is pumped in too, into these cells to kind of balance out this positive charge, but then chloride comes across to balance out this charge. So we get salts, we get glucose, we get a chloride, and we also have specific pumps for amino acids all going in. There's very little water that goes in. Some does, but we have these tight junctions, so there's a leaking of water, but mostly we're just making the blood more salty. So here's a list of all the things that are getting put into the tubes or taken out. And there's even some urea taken out here, but for the rest of it, these are mostly building blocks or necessary for the cell. Now, it is interesting that you have bicarbonate being put in, because if you remember your blood chemistry, bicarbonate will change that equilibrium of acid or protons and CO2 in the blood. So think about that. We can also have things brought into the proximal convoluted tubule, such as more ammonia pumped in, just general drugs and toxins. And this is usually a good thing, but sometimes these toxins can actually damage the proximal and well, the whole nephron unit. So it's in moderation. Now, the descending loop of Henle, if you remember, those had no tight junctions on those cells. They were just regular cells hooked together. So they were permeable to water. And I want you to make sure to write down that the major characteristic of the descending loop of Henle is that it is water permeable. So water can go wherever it needs to. That's important because as we go through the loop here and then go to the ascending limb, we notice that the characteristics have changed quite a bit. We have sodium and chloride, potassium, magnesium, calcium, and ammonia, all salts, except for ammonia, that can go out. So what happens is the blood that has just dropped off all its liquid in the glomerulus, and then it goes down the proximal convoluted tubule. The blood from that same dry blood goes past the proximal convoluted tubule, gets more salty and not a lot of water, and then goes past the ascending loop of Henle right here and gets more salt added, but this has tight junctions on it, so water can't follow. So the blood is getting saltier and saltier, and there is relatively less and less water there. So the blood comes past the ascending loop of, or sorry, the descending loop of Henle here, and all of a sudden, this really, really salty and dry blood comes across a whole amount of water here in the descending loop of Henle, and the water will want to dilute out the salts. So the water streams in to that vein, that venule, full of salty, dry blood, and dilutes out the salt, dilutes out that, or reconstitutes the blood. So we've gotten all the nutrients back in, we got the salts back in, and then we get the water back in. And it is without ammonia or urea for the most part. So it is a weird way to set it up, but proximal convoluted tubule to the ascending limb to make it salty, and then to the descending limb of loop of Henle to make the water go where we want it to. Now, there is the distal convoluted tubule, and I want you to mark that down as an area for homeostasis, because this is the area that doesn't change that much. That does change a lot there, that one. Now, what will happen is if your blood volume is too high and it's stretching those baryostat receptors, and we're having pressure in these blood vessels, that there will be a number of hormones that will go out. These hormones will cause the cells in the distal convoluted tubule to make more proton pumps, protons being hydrogen ions, and pump them from the blood into the urine here. Okay. And so the urine will get more acidic, but we're pulling some of those protons that were making the blood very acidic and taking them and putting them directly into our urine, which is one way to help balance out that extreme pH change. On the same time, you can put, it'll also pump in more bicarbonate or, bicarbonate in the collecting duct at the same time, to soak up more of those ions by making H2CO3. And then we have the balancing of that respiration there. So take a look at your equilibrium reaction for the breathing and then tie it into how the distal convoluted tubule can remove some protons from the blood and put it into the pee, and then also put more of the bicarbonate into the blood so that it can soak up more hydrogens and change the pH to a better state. Now, the distal convoluted tubule will also pump in salts if there isn't enough blood volume. So if there's too much, it will pump salts into the collecting duct and the distal convoluted tubule, and we will have more water in this tube. But if there isn't enough water in the blood, what the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct will do is put more salt into that blood. And again, saltiness will cause more water to stream in to dilute it out. So we have the blood coming past the proximal convoluted tubule, and it will come past the distal into this area between the distal and collecting duct and past the ascending limb here. So it normally gets salts pumped in at the ascending limb, but depending on how much need there is, there can be more or less of these salts pumped into the blood from the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. So those are variables. The ascending limb doesn't change its amount of salt that it puts into the blood very much. It's fairly constant, but the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct can change the amount of salt they put into the blood and therefore change the amount of water that's taken up. So if you're very, very dehydrated, your distal convoluted tubule will be pumping a lot of salt into your blood so that you're taking up the maximum amount of water from your urine. And that's when your urine will get highly concentrated and very deep yellow. That's a danger sign when you are peeing that concentrated of urine, and then you'll stop peeing because your body can't let loose any more water. So that's a major danger sign for dehydration and heat stroke. Now, so just remember that the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct both have variable amounts of salt uptake and proton delivery into the collecting duct and the distal convoluted tubule. One more thing I would like to note is that if you have more of a descending and ascending limb of the loop of Henle, you're going to have more water being able to or taken up by the blood vessels around it. So if we are able to measure, and we are able to measure the descending versus ascending loop of Henle, the osmolarity, so the osmotic gradient, the higher the number, the more concentrated it is. The more ions there are, the less water there is. So as we go down the descending loop of Henle, the urine becomes more and more concentrated and more salty. That is because the water is streaming out of this descending loop of Henle. It's water permeable and streaming into the very salty blood next to it. So there's less water here, but as it goes on, it goes to the ascending limb. And this is where salts are actively pumped into the blood that is coming past, and then it'll come past the descending limb. But the other key that this ascending limb is salt permeable, but water impermeable. That means water can't pass through. It has to be allowed through by a certain pump. And if you don't have that, you just have the salt. Higher and higher salt concentration where the water can't get across and dilute it. but it can here. So remember, water permeable for the descending limb, ascending limb. Salts can go past into the blood, which is salt permeable, but water cannot. Also note that the cortex is the proximal and distal convoluted tubule, as well as the glomerulus, not shown here, but the medulla contains the loop of Henle and the side of it, the collecting duct. Okay, I want you to think about that for today, and be able to explain how urine is concentrated based on osmotic gradient. Do not forget the homeostasis and what parts they do or that have that, and being able to draw out and label the parts of the nephron unit. Next time, we're going to finish off with the homeostasis of water salt balance, and we'll end our chapter on excretion. Keep an eye out for the quiz. It will involve digestion and excretion. Have a great day.